Kodak invented the digital camera. Then they killed it, not because they didn't understand it, not because leadership was blind or stupid or stuck in the past. They killed it because they understood exactly what it would do. It would destroy them. This is the story of a company that saw the future before anyone else and chose to bury it. Not out of ignorance, out of self-preservation. And that choice is what killed them anyway. In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer at Kodak named Steve Sasson built something that would change the world. It was ugly. It weighed 8 pounds. It took 23 seconds to record a single black and white image onto a cassette tape. The resolution was terrible, roughly 10,000 times worse than a modern smartphone. But it worked. It captured light without film. Steve Sasson had invented the digital camera. When he presented it to Kodak's executives, they were impressed by the technology and horrified by its implications. The response was not, "How do we commercialize this?" The response was, "How long do we have?" To understand why Kodak reacted this way, you have to understand what Kodak actually was. By the 1970s, Kodak wasn't just a successful company, it was an empire. The name was synonymous with photography itself. Kodak Moment had entered the language as shorthand for any memory worth preserving. The company held over 90% of the American film market and roughly 2/3 of the global market. It employed over 140,000 people at its peak. Its headquarters in Rochester, New York, was the economic engine of an entire city. But Kodak's real power wasn't brand recognition or market share, it was chemistry. Kodak manufactured film, and film was one of the most profitable products ever created. Here's why. Making photographic film requires extraordinary precision. Multiple chemical layers must be coated onto a plastic base at exact thicknesses, in exact sequences, under exact conditions. The tolerances are microscopic. The expertise is hard-won. The manufacturing infrastructure is enormously expensive to build. Once you've built it, though, the economics are incredible. The raw materials for a roll of film cost almost nothing: plastic, silver halide crystals, gelatin, dyes. But the finished product sold for dollars. And it's sold in massive quantities constantly because film gets used up. Every photograph consumed film. Every vacation, every birthday, every wedding required more rolls to be purchased. Unlike a camera, which you might buy once and keep for years, film was a perpetual revenue stream. This is called a consumables business model. And in the 1970s and 1980s, it was almost impossibly lucrative. Kodak's profit margins on film exceeded 60%. In some years, they approached 70%. To put that in perspective, most companies consider profit margins of 10 to 15% excellent. Kodak was operating at 4 to 5 times that level on its core product. But the money from film didn't stop there. Kodak also sold the chemicals used to develop film. It sold the paper photographs were printed on. It sold the processing equipment used by photolabs. It licensed its technology to manufacturers around the world. Every stage of the photographic process generated revenue, and at almost every stage, Kodak was either the dominant player or the primary supplier. This was vertical integration at its most complete. Kodak didn't just participate in the photography industry, Kodak was the photography industry. Now imagine you run this company. Every quarter, billions of dollars flow in. Your margins are extraordinary. Your market position is unassailable. Your brand is beloved worldwide. You have no serious competitors in your core business. You employ a small city's worth of workers who depend on you for their livelihoods. And then an engineer walks into a conference room with an 8-pound contraption and shows you a technology that requires no film. No film means no consumables. No consumables means no recurring revenue. No recurring revenue means the entire economic engine of your company begins to collapse. This is what Kodak's leadership understood immediately when they saw Sasson's invention. Digital photography wasn't a new product line to explore. It was a threat to everything. And they responded exactly the way powerful institutions respond to existential threats. They suppressed it. Sasson was told to keep quiet about the invention. Kodak's leadership didn't want competitors to know the technology was viable. More importantly, they didn't want to accelerate a future that would destroy their profit margins. Internal projections suggested digital photography wouldn't be commercially competitive with film for 15 to 20 years. That seemed like a comfortable buffer. That seemed like enough time to figure things out. So Kodak made a choice. Rather than develop digital technology aggressively, they would manage its emergence. They would file patents to control the intellectual property. They would monitor the market. They would position themselves to participate in the digital future if and when it became unavoidable. But they would not, under any circumstances, voluntarily undermine the film business that was generating those incredible margins. This wasn't stupidity. This was strategy. The problem is that strategy was built on a fatal assumption that Kodak could control the pace of change, that because they had invented the technology, they could decide when it reached the market, that the future would wait for them to be ready. This assumption was wrong, but it would take decades for the consequences to fully arrive, and by the time they did, the trap had already closed. Kodak saw the future more clearly than anyone else in the industry. They had the technology, the patents, the resources, and the expertise to dominate digital photography before the market even existed. They chose not to. Not because they didn't understand what was coming, because they understood exactly what was coming, and it threatened everything they had built. Kodak saw the future clearly and decided it was too dangerous to release. Kodak knew digital was coming. They had the patents. They had the engineers. They had decades of warning. So why didn't they pivot? The answer isn't incompetence. It isn't denial. It isn't some failure to read the market correctly. The answer is simpler and more uncomfortable. Pivoting would have meant destroying themselves. To understand why, you need to understand a concept called cannibalization. In business, cannibalization happens when a company's new product eats into sales of its existing product. You launch something new, and instead of bringing in fresh revenue, it just steals customers from something you already sell. For most companies, cannibalization is a manageable risk. You accept some losses in one area to gain ground in another. The math usually works out. For Kodak, the math was catastrophic. Film generated profit margins above 60%. Digital cameras, even in the best case, would generate margins closer to 15 or 20%, the same as most consumer electronics. That's not a small difference. That's a collapse. Every dollar of revenue that moved from film to digital wasn't just a dollar moved. It was a dollar that became worth a fraction of what it had been. Kodak's entire financial structure, its workforce, its facilities, its dividends, its R&D budget, its very identity, was built on film margins. Digital didn't just threaten a product line, it threatened the economic foundation of the company. And here's the part that made the trap inescapable. Kodak couldn't do both. It wasn't possible to aggressively pursue digital while also protecting film. Every marketing dollar spent promoting digital cameras was a dollar arguing against film. Every engineering team assigned to digital was a team not improving film products. Every success in digital accelerated the decline of the business that actually paid the bills. The incentives were impossible. If you were a division head at Kodak in the 1980s or 1990s, your bonus depended on film sales. Your department's budget depended on film revenue. Your career advancement depended on hitting film targets. Digital wasn't your opportunity. Digital was your enemy. This is how institutions actually work. People inside companies don't optimize for long-term survival. They optimize for the metrics they're measured on. They respond to the incentives in front of them. They protect the revenue streams that protect their jobs. Kodak's internal structure was designed rationally, logically, understandably to defend film at all costs, and so it did. Even when leadership recognized the threat, the organization couldn't respond. The antibodies were too strong. The cultural immune system rejected digital the way a body rejects a transplanted organ. Engineers who pushed digital initiatives were sidelined. Projects that threatened film revenue were defunded. Internal reports warning about disruption were acknowledged and then ignored. The company funded digital research. It filed digital patents. It even launched digital products occasionally, but never with full commitment, never with the resources that film commanded, never in a way that might actually threaten the core business. Kodak's digital efforts were always hedged, always cautious, always subordinate to the product that actually made money. Meanwhile, competitors were making different calculations. Sony didn't have a film business to protect. Neither did Canon's electronics division. Neither did the dozens of Asian manufacturers who began entering the digital camera market in the 1990s. For them, digital wasn't cannibalization. Digital was just opportunity. They didn't have 60% margins to defend. They didn't have a chemical manufacturing empire to justify. They didn't have 140,000 employees whose jobs depended on a legacy technology. They had nothing to lose. So they moved fast. Sony launched the Mavica in 1981, a still video camera that recorded images to floppy disks. The quality was terrible. The market wasn't ready. But Sony kept pushing. They weren't waiting for digital to be perfect. They were learning. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the technology improved. Sensors got better. Storage got cheaper. Resolution increased. Each generation of digital cameras was better than the last. Kodak watched this happen. They had the patents. They had the expertise. They could have led. Instead, they kept asking the wrong question. The question Kodak asked was, how do we protect our film business while digital grows? The question they should have asked was, how do we survive when film disappears? But that question was too threatening. It implied that film would disappear, and the entire organization was built on the assumption that film was forever. So Kodak compromised. They released digital cameras but priced them to protect film margins. They built digital products but starved them of marketing resources. They entered the digital market but never committed to winning it. The strategy was to participate in digital without letting digital win. This is what institutional self-preservation looks like. Not blindness, not stupidity. Just a slow, rational, perfectly understandable refusal to accept that the world has changed. Kodak's leaders weren't idiots. Many of them understood exactly what was happening. Internal memos from the 1980s and 1990s show sophisticated analysis of digital disruption. The company's own research predicted the decline of film with remarkable accuracy. They saw it coming. They just couldn't act on what they saw, because acting would have meant accepting losses today to prevent losses tomorrow. It would have meant cannibalizing their own profits. It would have meant telling shareholders that the most profitable product in company history was dying. No one wanted to deliver that message. So the message was never delivered, and every year the trap closed a little tighter. Film revenue funded the digital research that was supposed to save the company, but film revenue also created the incentive to delay digital adoption. The more money film made, the harder it was to abandon. The harder it was to abandon, the less committed the digital efforts became. Success had become a prison. The very thing that made Kodak powerful, those incredible film margins, was now the thing preventing adaptation. The company couldn't leap to digital because the leap required sacrificing everything that made Kodak what it was. This is the paradox that kills institutions. The resources that fund your survival are the same resources that prevent you from changing. The profits that give you options are the same profits that make every option feel like a loss. Kodak had more money, more talent, and more knowledge than any competitor, and none of it mattered, because they were optimizing for a world that was already ending. By the late 1990s, the window was closing. Digital cameras were improving rapidly. Prices were falling. Consumer adoption was accelerating. Kodak had spent 2 decades managing digital instead of leading it. They had filed patents instead of building products. They had protected margins instead of building the future. And now the future was arriving whether they were ready or not. Kodak didn't lose to competitors who were smarter. They lost to competitors who had nothing to protect. Kodak didn't lose to better technology. They lost to their own success. By the year 2000, Kodak was still a giant. Revenue was strong. The brand was iconic. Film sales, while slowing, remained profitable. Leadership talked about digital strategy on earnings calls and pointed to new product launches as evidence of adaptation. From the outside, the company looked like it was managing the transition. From the inside, the math was already terminal. Digital camera adoption wasn't following a gentle curve. It was accelerating. Each year, more consumers switched. Each year, film volumes dropped faster than projected. Each year, the assumptions underlying Kodak's business got a little more disconnected from reality, and then the curve went vertical. Between 2000 and 2005, digital camera sales exploded globally. Prices fell below what mainstream consumers had been paying for film cameras. Image quality reached good enough for most purposes. The friction of film, buying rolls, dropping them off, waiting for prints, paying for development, suddenly felt intolerable. Kodak's internal projections had assumed a gradual transition, 15 years, maybe 20. Enough time to extract remaining value from film while slowly building digital capabilities. The market gave them less than a decade. By 2005, film sales were collapsing, not declining. Photo labs were closing. Drugstores were removing film displays. An entire infrastructure that had existed for a century was evaporating. Kodak scrambled. They launched more digital cameras. They acquired photo-sharing websites. They pivoted to inkjet printers, trying to recreate the consumables model by selling ink instead of film. They licensed their vast patent portfolio, extracting billions in settlements from companies using technology Kodak had invented but never commercialized. None of it worked. The digital cameras were undifferentiated, competing against dozens of Asian manufacturers with lower costs and faster product cycles. The photo-sharing acquisitions were too small and too late. The printer strategy never achieved the margins film had generated. The patent licensing was lucrative but finite, a one-time extraction rather than a sustainable business. Kodak was flailing, and then the real disruption arrived. Everything that had happened so far, the shift from film to digital cameras, was just the prelude. The true extinction event wasn't digital cameras at all. It was smartphones. In 2007, Apple launched the iPhone. Within a few years, smartphones with built-in cameras had become ubiquitous. Suddenly, everyone carried a camera in their pocket at all times. Not a great camera initially, but a camera that was always there. The best camera, it turned out, was the one you had with you. Dedicated digital cameras, the market Kodak had spent 20 years failing to dominate, began to collapse almost immediately. Why carry a separate device when your phone could take pictures and share them instantly? The photography industry wasn't just going digital, it was disappearing into another product entirely. Kodak had spent decades preparing to compete in a digital camera market. That market barely existed by the time they arrived. This is what disruption actually looks like. Not a single shift you can prepare for, a cascade of shifts that compound faster than institutions can adapt. Film to digital was the first wave, digital cameras to smartphones was the second, and the second wave didn't just change the technology. It changed the entire behavior of photography. People no longer took photographs to preserve memories. They took photographs to communicate, to share, to post. Images became social currency, not archival records. Everything Kodak understood about photography, the careful composition, the special occasions, the printing and storing and preserving, became irrelevant almost overnight. The company wasn't just behind on technology, it was behind on culture. In January 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The announcement was treated as a surprise by people who hadn't been paying attention. For anyone who understood the numbers, it was simply the paperwork catching up to reality. A company that had once employed 140,000 people was reduced to a fraction of that. A brand synonymous with memory itself became a cautionary tale. A city that had been built on Kodak's success entered an economic decline it still hasn't fully recovered from. The bankruptcy wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a delayed consequence. Kodak had been dying for 30 years. The bankruptcy was just the moment when the life support finally switched off. And here's what makes this story more than a business history. Kodak's failure is not unique. The pattern repeats constantly across the economy. Successful institutions see disruption coming. They have the resources to respond. They understand the threat intellectually, and they fail anyway, because the same structures that create success also prevent adaptation. The same profits that fund research also create incentives to delay change. The same organizational logic that enables scale also resists transformation. Intel saw mobile computing coming and chose to protect PC chip margins. They ceded the smartphone market to ARM and spent a decade trying to catch up. Meta saw that attention was shifting to new platforms and chose to protect Facebook's model. They spent tens of billions trying to own the next paradigm rather than adapting to actual user behavior. Legacy banks saw digital finance emerging and chose to protect branch networks and fee structures. They're now fighting for relevance against apps that didn't exist 10 years ago. The pattern is always the same. The institution sees the future. The institution has the resources to lead. The institution chooses to protect what already exists. The future arrives anyway. Seeing is not enough. Resources are not enough. Even understanding is not enough. What matters is willingness to sacrifice the present for the future. And that willingness is precisely what successful institutions lack, because sacrifice is loss. And institutions are designed to prevent loss, not accept it. This is the trap Kodak fell into. Not ignorance, not arrogance, not stupidity, just the rational, structural, perfectly understandable refusal to destroy yourself today in order to survive tomorrow. Kodak had every advantage. They invented the technology. They had the patents. They had the money. They had the talent. They had 30 years of warning. None of it mattered because they were asking the wrong question. They kept asking how to protect film while digital grew. They never asked how to survive when film disappeared. By the time they were forced to ask the right question, the answer was already, you can't. The future doesn't negotiate. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't care about your profit margins or your organizational chart or your legacy infrastructure. It doesn't respect your market share or your brand equity or your century of history. The future simply arrives, and it replaces whatever refuses to adapt. Kodak didn't miss the future. They saw it before anyone else. They held it in their hands in 1975. They had more knowledge about what was coming than any competitor on Earth. They rejected it because the future was threatening, because adaptation was painful, because protecting what existed felt safer than building what came next. That rejection didn't stop the future from arriving. It just ensured that Kodak wouldn't be part of it. This is what institutional failure actually looks like. Not blindness, not incompetence, not a failure of imagination. Just a system optimizing for the wrong thing until optimization becomes irrelevant. Kodak didn't fail because they couldn't see. They failed because they couldn't let go. And the future didn't care.